It started with a scream that could have woken up half of D.C., not the kind you'd hear in a back alley or a bar fight, but the kind that echoes through marble halls and makes you wonder who's about to lose everything. That's how the day kicked off in Judge Leonard Hayes' courtroom, a place where justice was supposed to live, but lately felt more like a slaughterhouse for anyone waving a red flag. Hayes had a reputation, sharp as a razor, mean as a junkyard dog, and twice as unpredictable. Word on the street was he'd turned his gavel into a weapon, especially against folks who leaned too far right for his liking. And today, he was in rare form, tearing into his clerk over something as petty as a misplaced file, like she'd personally insulted his mother. The guy had been on edge all week, ever since whispers started floating around about a big case tied to Mike Donovan, a small-time businessman with a heart for charity and a knack for pissing off the wrong people. Donovan wasn't some Wall Street shark or a slick politician. He was the kind of guy who'd give you the shirt off his back and then apologize for it not being ironed. But here he was, dragged into federal court on a tax evasion rap that smelled fishier than a week-old catch. The charge? Skimming cash from donations he'd funneled into Family First, a grassroots outfit helping struggling folks in Ohio. It was the kind of case that could have been settled with a slap on the wrist, but Hayes wasn't in the mood for mercy. He wanted blood, and he wanted it public. By the time the clock hit 9, the gallery was packed. Reporters, locals, even a few suits from up the chain who knew something was about to go down. Hayes didn't disappoint. He stormed in late, barking orders like a drill sergeant who'd skipped his morning coffee. First, he chewed out the clerk again, loud enough for the cheap seats to hear, accusing her of sabotaging his day before it even started. Then he turned his sights on the defense team, threatening to lock them up for contempt if they didn't hustle up with their opening statements. The guy was a walking hurricane, and everyone in that room knew it was only a matter of time before he zeroed in on his real target. That's when J.D. Vance walked in. Yeah, the J.D. Vance, vice president, Ohio's own, the guy who'd gone from hillbilly roots to the second seat in the nation. He wasn't there to grandstand or throw his weight around. He'd been called as a witness, plain and simple, to vouch for Donovan's books. Vance had history with Family First, back when he was still climbing the political ladder, and he'd seen firsthand how every dime went straight to the people who needed it. But Hayes didn't care about facts or goodwill. To him, Vance was a trophy, a chance to flex his power and stick it to the Trump crowd he'd spent years railing against. The air shifted when Vance stepped up, not because of some dramatic entrance, but because everyone knew this was about to turn into a cage match. Hayes didn't waste a second. Before Vance could even settle in, the judge lit into him like a pit bull on a mailman. He called him out by name, dripping sarcasm all over the title, Mr. Vice President, and made it crystal clear this wasn't the Senate or some cushy White House briefing. "You're in my house now," Hayes snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a buzzsaw. He didn't just want Vance to know his place. He wanted to humiliate him, to strip away the prestige and leave him looking like some small-town nobody who'd wandered into the wrong fight. It was personal, and Hayes wasn't shy about showing it. The crowd ate it up. Some were there for the drama, others for the politics, but they all smelled the same thing, a showdown brewing that'd either end in fireworks or a knockout. Hayes had spent years building his myth, untouchable, unbreakable, the kind of judge who could make or break you with a flick of his pen. He'd taken down bigger fish than Donovan without breaking a sweat, and now he had Vance in his crosshairs. The guy thought he was above the law, a king in his own fiefdom, and he figured this was just another day at the office. Smash a conservative, score some points, call it justice. Problem was, he didn't know Vance had come loaded for bear. See, Vance wasn't there to play punching bag. He'd gotten wind of something rotten in Hayes' world, whispers from insiders, a paper trail that didn't add up, and a hunch that the judge's hate wasn't just ideological. It was dirty, real dirty, the kind of dirty that could sink a career and light up the evening news for months. Hayes might have thought he was running the show, but Vance had a card up his sleeve, one that had turned this whole circus upside down. The judge wanted a scalp, Vance wanted the truth. And in a room full of sharks, Only one of them was swimming with a harpoon. That's how it started, a powder keg waiting for a match. Hayes thought he could roll over Vance like he'd done to so many others, but he didn't count on karma lurking in the wings. This wasn't just about Donovan's case anymore. It was about a reckoning, the kind that hits fast and leaves you wondering how the mighty fall so hard. By the end of the day, that courtroom would be a battlefield, and the casualties wouldn't be who Hayes expected. Sometimes justice doesn't knock politely. It kicks the door down and dares you to fight back. The moment jdvance took the stand, you could feel the room brace itself, like the hush before a bar brawl when the jukebox cuts out. He was there to testify, nothing fancy, just a straight-up account of Mike Donovan's work with Family First. Vance knew the numbers cold. Every dollar tracked, every receipt filed, every family helped. He'd seen the books himself back in the day, back when he was still pounding pavement in Ohio, not riding shotgun in the White House. This wasn't some grand conspiracy or a political stunt. It was about a guy who'd done right by his community, now getting railroaded by a system that didn't give a damn. But Leonard Hayes wasn't buying it. The judge didn't even let Vance get through his first sentence before he pounced. He cut him off mid-breath, voice sharp enough to slice through concrete, and laid into him like a prosecutor with a grudge. "This isn't your Senate floor, Mr. Vice President," Hayes sneered, dragging out the title like it was a punchline. "You don't get to waltz in here with your fancy DC credentials and spin me some fairy tale about charity." It was a cheap shot, loud and public, meant to knock Vance down a peg in front of everyone watching. Hayes wasn't just running a courtroom, he was putting on a show, and Vance was the unwilling star. The gallery buzzed, a mix of gasps and whispers, but Vance didn't flinch. He'd dealt with worse than Hayes. Heck, he'd grown up dodging bigger bullies than this guy in the hollers of Appalachia. He started again, calm as you please, laying out how Donovan had kept Family First squeaky clean, how the tax evasion charge was a stretch thinner than a dime store rubber band. But Hayes wasn't having it. Every word out of Vance's mouth seemed to light a fresh fuse under the judge. He interrupted again, louder this time, accusing Vance of turning his courtroom into a damn campaign rally. The insult landed hard, and for a second, it felt like Hayes might actually win the crowd. That's when Vance decided to stop playing nice. He didn't raise his voice or sling mud back. He just shifted gears. He mentioned Family First partnership with another group, Liberty Bell, and a meeting on March 15 that Donovan had attended. It was a casual drop, almost an aside, but it hit Hayes like a sucker punch. The judge slammed his gavel down so fast it sounded like a gunshot, cutting Vance off before he could finish. "That's enough," Hayes barked, his tone jagged and raw. "None of that's relevant to this case, and I won't have you wasting my time with your nonsense." The room went quiet, but not the good kind. More like the silence before a storm breaks. Vance didn't push back right away. He let the moment hang, let Hayes stew in his own bluster. The judge was doubling down now, railing about how he wouldn't let some Trump lackey derail his court. It was a low blow, tying Vance to the former president like a cheap tabloid headline, and Hayes milked it for all it was worth. He turned to the defense table, snapping at Donovan's lawyer to quit stalling and stick to the charges. Tax evasion, plain and simple. No sob stories, no detours, no mercy. The guy was on a roll, drunk on his own power, and he figured he had Vance cornered. But Hayes didn't see the trap closing. Vance had come prepared, and that little mention of Liberty Bell wasn't random. He'd heard rumors, whispers from a clerk who'd had enough, a tip from an old Ohio contact who'd seen Hayes' name on some shady paperwork. Liberty Bell wasn't just another charity. It was a front, a slush fund with ties to people who hated guys like Donovan and Vance on principle. That March 15 meeting, it wasn't just a footnote. It was the first thread in a web Hayes had spent years spinning, and Vance was about to start pulling. The judge kept up his tirade, mocking Vance's title again, calling him out for thinking he could swagger in here and rewrite the rules. It was theater, pure and simple, and Hayes was eating up the spotlight. He didn't notice the shift in the room, the way the prosecutor's table went quiet, the way Donovan's lawyer started scribbling notes like a man possessed. Hayes thought he was untouchable, that his bench was a throne nobody could topple. He'd humiliated Vance, or so he figured, and that was enough to keep the day on track. What he didn't know was that Vance wasn't there to lose. The vice president had a knack for turning the tables, a grit forged in tougher spots than this. Hayes could yell all he wanted, but Vance had the receipts, literal and figurative, and he was just getting warmed up. The judge wanted a fight. He was about to get one. This wasn't about pride or politics anymore. It was about shining a light on the rot Hayes thought he'd buried deep. And when that light hit, it burned hotter than anything Hayes could handle. Things were heating up fast in Leonard Hayes' courtroom, and it wasn't because of the stale coffee or the cheap suits in the gallery. The judge had jdvance pinned under his thumb, or so he thought, and he wasn't about to let up. Hayes was on a tear, treating the whole place like his personal fiefdom, and he just finished slapping Vance down for daring to mention Liberty Bell. Now it was the defense's turn to feel the heat. Mike Donovan's lawyer kicked off with a solid opener, laying out how every cent from Family First went straight to food banks and job programs, stuff that kept small towns like Donovan's afloat. It was a good pitch, the kind of thing that'd sway a jury anywhere else in America. But Hayes wasn't anywhere else. He cut the lawyer off before he could even finish the first point, voice booming like a foghorn over a quiet lake. "I don't need a sermon about your client's bleeding heart," he snapped, making it clear he'd already written Donovan off as guilty. The lawyer tried again, pivoting to hard numbers, tax filings, donor logs, the works, but Hayes wasn't having it. Every time the guy brought up Donovan's community gigs, Hayes shut it down with a barked irrelevant and a gavel slam that sounded more like a war drum. The defense was scrambling, and Hayes was loving every second of it. That's when Vance stepped back into the fray. He wasn't loud about it, didn't try to steal the spotlight, just picked up where he'd left off, calm and steady. He started talking about Family First's books again, how he'd seen them firsthand, how they tied into Liberty Bell's outreach. It was a simple play, nothing flashy, but it landed like a brick through a window. Hayes exploded, cutting Vance off mid-sentence with a venom that could have peeled paint. "You think you can sneak that garbage in here?" he roared, accusing Vance of dragging politics into his sacred courtroom. The judge was practically spitting fire, calling it a circus act, and warning Vance to keep his mouth shut or face contempt. The gallery stirred, a low hum of chatter rippling through the crowd. Hayes was putting on a hell of a show, and he knew it. He turned his wrath back on the defense, tearing into the lawyer for letting Vance run wild with his testimony. The guy tried to argue something about context, about Donovan's clean record, but Hayes drowned him out, shouting that he didn't care about sob stories or conservative fairy tales. It was a one-man war, and Hayes was swinging for the fences, determined to bury Donovan and Vance in the same shallow grave. The gavel kept coming down, punctuating every rant like a judge's version of a mic drop. Vance didn't back off, though. He waited out the storm, then went right back in, cool as a cucumber. This time he dropped a name, Quincy Miller, a small business owner who'd gotten torched in Hayes Court a year back. Same deal, charity work, tax beef, evidence tossed out before it could see daylight. Vance tied it to Donovan's case, hinting at a pattern Hayes wouldn't want anyone sniffing around. The judge didn't miss a beat, jumping on it like a dog on a bone. "That's ancient history and off the table," Hayes snapped, but there was a hitch in his voice, a crack nobody could ignore. He was still loud, still in charge, but something was off, like a guy who just heard a ghost rattle its chains. The crowd picked up on it too. Whispers turned to murmurs, and even the prosecutor's table started shifting uncomfortably. Hayes doubled down, railing at Vance for daring to lecture him in his own house. He called him a Trump stooge again, leaning hard on the insult like it was his ace in the hole. The judge was all bluster now, painting Vance as some slick politico trying to dodge the real issue, Donovan's supposed crimes. He told the defense to move on, no more detours, no more charity propaganda, or he'd shut the whole thing down and call it a day. But Vance had lit a fuse, and Hayes couldn't stomp it out fast enough. That Quincy Miller mention wasn't random. It was a breadcrumb, one Hayes didn't want followed. The judge kept up his tirade, mocking Vance's title for the third time that hour, acting like he was untouchable. He didn't see the net tightening, didn't clock how every outburst was digging him deeper. Vance wasn't just testifying anymore. He was baiting the hook, and Hayes was biting hard. The room was a pressure cooker, ready to blow, and the judge's reign was starting to look a lot shakier than he'd ever admit. Karma's funny like that. It doesn't shout, it just waits. The courtroom was a live wire by now, buzzing with the kind of tension that makes you hold your breath without even knowing it. Leonard Hayes had turned the place into his personal coliseum, and he was still swinging his gavel like a gladiator's sword, hacking away at anything J.D. Vance or Mike Donovan's lawyer threw up. The defense was on its heels, trying to claw back some ground, but Hayes wasn't giving an inch. He'd just finished shredding their latest pitch about Donovan's clean slate, calling it more conservative smoke and mirrors, when Vance decided it was time to turn the heat up a notch. He didn't raise his voice or play to the crowd, just slid a new piece into the puzzle, smooth as a card shark dealing an ace. He brought up that March 15th meeting again, the one tied to Liberty Bell, and this time he didn't let it hang. He said Donovan had been there, hashing out plans to fund a youth center, and that every dollar was accounted for. Receipts, signatures, the works. It was a straight shot, no fluff, but it landed like a grenade in Hayes' lap. The judge cut him off before he could finish, voice cracking like a whip. "That's inadmissible, and you know it," Hayes barked, slamming the gavel so hard it echoed twice. "I won't let you drag this court through your mud." The gallery went dead quiet for a beat, then erupted in whispers. Hayes wasn't just mad. He was rattled, and it showed. Vance didn't blink, didn't push back right away. He let the judge stew, let the crowd chew on that little slip. Hayes tried to bulldoze over it, turning on Donovan's lawyer with a fresh tirade about sticking to the damn charges. The guy stammered out a response, something about due process, but Hayes drowned him out, accusing the whole defense of stalling with irrelevant garbage. It was a full-on meltdown, and the judge was leaning into it, figuring noise could bury whatever Vance was digging at. Then Vance dropped the hammer. He mentioned a bank transfer, 50 grand, wired from a Liberty Bell account to an offshore stash, dated March 16th, the day after that meeting. He didn't say whose account, didn't need to. The implication hung there like smoke after a gunshot, and Hayes lost it. "That's a lie," he shouted, cutting Vance off mid-sentence. "You've got no proof, no standing, nothing. I'll have you cited for contempt if you keep this up." The threat was loud, desperate, and it only made the room lean in closer. The prosecutor's table stayed silent, but you could tell they were sweating now. This wasn't in the script. Hayes kept swinging, calling Vance a political hack and a Trump errand boy, trying to claw back control. He told the defense to move on, no more side trips down conspiracy lane, or he'd end the day with Donovan in cuffs. But Vance wasn't done. He brought up another case, Sarah Jennings, a single mom who'd lost everything in Hayes Court last spring, same song and dance, charity work dismissed, evidence blocked, ruling handed down like a guillotine. He tied it to Donovan, hinting at a playbook Hayes had been running for years. The judge snapped back, claiming it was unrelated and out of bounds. But his voice had an edge now, sharp and unsteady. The crowd was hooked, murmuring like they'd just seen the twist in a late-night thriller. Hayes tried to shut it down, warning Vance one last time to watch his step or face the consequences. He was still the king of this castle, still barking orders, but the cracks were showing. That 50 grand drop wasn't some wild guess. Vance had the goods, courtesy of a tip from a clerk who'd seen too much. Liberty Bell wasn't just a name, it was a lifeline for Hayes, a dirty little secret he'd buried under years of bluster and bad faith. And now Vance was tugging at the thread, slow and deliberate, letting Hayes unravel himself. The judge kept up the front, mocking Vance's title again, calling him out for thinking he could waltz in and rewrite my rules. He was loud, defiant, clinging to the idea that he was untouchable. But every rant, every gavel slam was digging him deeper. The prosecutor's silence was deafening. The defense lawyer was scribbling like mad, and the gallery was eating it up. Hayes thought he could bully his way out, thought his bench was a fortress. He didn't see Vance building a case brick by brick, didn't realize the trap was already sprung. The man wanted a fight, and he was getting one, just not the kind he'd bargained for. Truth's got a way of sneaking up on you like that, especially when you've spent years running from it. The courtroom was a powder keg now, and Leonard Hayes was the fool dancing around with a lit match. He'd just finished tearing into J.D. Vance over that 50-grand bombshell, swearing up and down it was a fabrication, a cheap shot from a desperate man. His voice was still ringing out, loud and jagged, accusing Vance of dragging his court into the gutter with baseless lies. The judge was on a roll, hammering the defense for letting this circus spiral out of control, and he wasn't slowing down. He told Donovan's lawyer to wrap it up or face contempt alongside his client, classic Hayes, ruling by fear and noise. But Vance wasn't rattled. He waited out the storm, then came back swinging, cool as ever. He didn't shout or point fingers, just laid out the next piece like it was nothing. He mentioned a document, a signed order from Hayes himself, dated last fall, telling a clerk to shred evidence in a case tied to Liberty Bell. It was a gut punch, quiet and precise, and it landed hard. Hayes cut him off before he could finish, shouting that it was hearsay and inadmissible, but the damage was done. The gallery buzzed like a hive, and even the prosecutor's table couldn't hide their unease. This was veering into territory nobody had prepped for. Hayes doubled down, calling Vance a con artist and a Trump puppet, leaning on the same old insults to keep the crowd in his corner. He turned on the defense again, barking at the lawyer to quit feeding me this garbage and stick to the tax rap. The guy tried to argue, stammering about discovery rules, but Hayes drowned him out, slamming the gavel like he was trying to break it. He was still the loudest voice in the room, still acting like he owned the place, but there was a hitch now, a stutter in his rhythm that hadn't been there before. He was losing the script, and Vance knew it. That's when Vance dropped the real bomb. He pulled out a bank record, 200 grand, wired from Liberty Bell to an offshore account, time-stamped right after Hayes had tanked a case against another conservative last summer. He didn't say it was Hayes' account. Didn't have to. The implication was a neon sign, and the judge flipped out. "That's a setup," Hayes yelled, cutting Vance off mid-sentence. "You've got no proof, no jurisdiction, nothing. I'll have you hauled out of here in cuffs." The threat was wild, unhinged, and it only made the room lean in closer. The prosecutor's crew went silent. Donovan's lawyer stopped breathing, and the gallery was a sea of wide eyes and hushed voices. Hayes kept swinging, accusing Vance of planting evidence, of turning his courtroom into a political hit job. He told the bailiff to get ready, warned Vance he'd be in lockup by sundown if he didn't shut up. The judge was a tornado now, ripping through every shred of composure he'd ever had, and it was a sight to behold. He called Vance every name in the book, lackey, fraud, Washington clown, and swore he'd bury this case and everyone in it. But the louder he got, the shakier he sounded, like a guy who'd just seen his own ghost. Vance didn't budge. He let Hayes rant, let him dig the hole deeper, then hit him again. He brought up a recording, grainy but legit, from a clerk's phone, catching Hayes mid-order to lose a file that could have cleared Donovan's name. It was short, just a few seconds, but it was dynamite. Hayes screamed over it, calling it fake and illegal, but the room wasn't buying it anymore. The gallery erupted, murmurs turning to outright chatter, and the prosecutor's table looked like they wanted to bolt. Hayes tried to claw back control, shouting for order, threatening to clear the place out, but his voice was cracking now, raw and frantic. The judge was coming apart, piece by piece. He yelled at Vance to sit down, told the defense they were done, swore he'd end this farce right then and there. But every word was a shovel, burying him deeper in the mess he'd made. That 200 grand transfer wasn't a guess. It was real, tied to Hayes by a paper trail Vance had locked down tight. The recording? Straight from a clerk who'd finally had enough of the threats. Hayes thought he could bully his way through, thought his bench was a shield. He didn't see the walls closing in, didn't clock how every outburst was a nail in his coffin. Vance wasn't just fighting back, he was dismantling the whole damn game, and Hayes was too blind to stop it. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to yell. It just needs to stand there and watch you fall. The courtroom had turned into a full-on train wreck, and Leonard Hayes was the conductor screaming as the whole thing went off the rails. He just lost it over J.D. Vance's recording, that damning snippet of him telling a clerk to ditch evidence like it was yesterday's trash. The judge was still yelling, calling it a forgery and a setup, swearing he'd have Vance in cuffs before the clock hit noon. His voice was a jackhammer, pounding away at the last scraps of his authority, but the room wasn't listening anymore. The gallery was a chorus of gasps and chatter. The prosecutor's table was frozen, and even Donovan's lawyer looked like he'd won the lottery without buying a ticket. Hayes kept swinging, wild and desperate. He told the bailiff to grab Vance, barked at the defense to shut down their circus act, and swore he'd clear the place out if he had to. He was clinging to the edge, accusing Vance of treason, fraud, anything that stick. But it was all noise now. Empty, frantic noise. The guy was a cornered animal, snapping at shadows, and every word out of his mouth was just another shovelful of dirt on his own grave. He didn't see it yet, didn't get that the game was up. He still thought he could bully his way out, still thought his bench was a fortress nobody could breach. That's when the doors swung open and the cavalry rolled in. Not some dramatic movie moment, just a handful of FBI suits led by Special Agent Sarah Klein, cutting through the chaos like a cold wind. She didn't shout, didn't need to. Her voice carried clean and sharp, announcing that the court was now under federal investigation, and Hayes was the star of the show. She rattled off the charges: bribery, obstruction, abuse of power, like she was reading a grocery list, but every word hit the room like a thunderclap. The gallery went dead silent, the kind of hush that comes when you know you're watching history go down. Hayes flipped out, full meltdown mode. He shouted over Klein, claiming immunity, yelling about his connections and how they couldn't touch him. "I'm a federal judge," he roared, like that was some magic shield. He accused Vance of orchestrating it all, called it a Trump witch hunt, and swore he'd sue every last one of them into the ground. But the agents weren't fazed. They'd heard it all before. Klein just kept talking, calm and steady, laying out how they'd been tracking Hayes for months, how Liberty Bell was the tip of an iceberg that sank him and half a dozen others. The evidence was ironclad: bank records, wiretaps, witness statements, and Hayes was caught flat-footed. Vance didn't say a word, didn't need to. He stood there, letting the feds do their thing, watching Hayes unravel like a cheap sweater. The judge tried to bargain, then threaten, then beg, all in the span of a minute. He claimed he'd been framed, swore he'd expose the real crooks if they'd just listen. But Klein wasn't biting. She told him to save it for his lawyer. And that was that. The bailiff hesitated, caught between duty and disbelief. But the agents didn't wait. They moved in, snapping the cuffs on Hayes like it was routine. The sound of metal clicking shut cut through the room, louder than any gavel ever could. Donovan's case collapsed right then and there. The prosecutor threw up his hands, muttering about tainted proceedings, and Klein didn't argue. She told the defense they were free to go, and just like that, Mike Donovan walked out a free man, vindicated, not by a jury, but by the mess Hayes had made. The gallery erupted, a mix of cheers and stunned whispers, as the agents hauled Hayes toward the door. He kept yelling, even as they dragged him out, promising revenge, swearing he'd be back. But nobody believed him, not anymore. Vance stayed quiet through it all, just watching the fallout. Hayes had thought he was untouchable, thought he could steamroll anyone who crossed him. He'd humiliated Vance, mocked Donovan, built his little empire on dirty cash and buried evidence. But now he was the one in chains, and the courtroom, his kingdom, was a crime scene. The feds didn't waste time. They started boxing up files, questioning clerks, locking down anything Hayes might have touched. It was swift, surgical, and brutal in its own way, a takedown that echoed far beyond this one day. The dust hadn't even settled, but the message was clear. Nobody's above the law, not even the guy holding the gavel. Hayes had rolled the dice, bet big on his own invincibility, and lost everything in a heartbeat. Vance didn't gloat, didn't need to. He'd come to tell the truth, and the truth had done the rest. Sometimes justice doesn't need a speech. It just needs a spark and a hell of a lot of nerve. Leonard Hayes was gone, hauled out of his own courtroom in cuffs, still yelling about conspiracies and comebacks as the FBI dragged him through the doors. The echo of his last rant hung in the air, but it was drowned out quick by the hum of a room waking up from a bad dream. jdvance didn't stick around to soak it in. He grabbed his coat, nodded to Mike Donovan's lawyer, and headed out like it was just another day at the office. But it wasn't. The dust was still swirling. And what happened next would ripple further than anyone in that gallery could have guessed. By the time the evening news hit, Hayes was a headline, big, bold, and ugly. The feds didn't waste a minute, peeling back layers of his dirty little empire like it was an onion they couldn't wait to toss. That 200 grand transfer Vance had dropped? Just the start. They found more. Hundreds of thousands funneled through Liberty Bell, wired to offshore accounts tied to Hayes and a handful of other judges who'd ruled the same way, same time, same targets. It wasn't a fluke. It was a machine, greased with cash and aimed square at anyone who didn't toe the right line. Conservative business owners, small-time activists, even a grandma who'd crossed the wrong donor, all chewed up and spit out by Hayes and his crew. Donovan's case was the first domino to fall. The feds called it a wash, too tainted to stand, and a new judge took one look at the unburied evidence and tossed the charges out like week-old leftovers. Mike walked free, back to his life, back to family first, a little shaken but whole. Word spread fast, and soon other cases started popping up, old rulings Hayes had slammed through, now cracking open under the spotlight. People who'd lost everything, businesses, homes, reputations, started coming forward, armed with stories that matched Vance's paper trail. The courthouse wasn't just a building anymore. It was a crime scene, and the cleanup was just getting started. Vance didn't go home and pop champagne. He was back in D.C. by nightfall, digging through files, chasing leads that come his way from who knows where. That recording, those bank records, they didn't just fall into his lap. Someone had tipped him off, someone deep enough in Hayes' Vance world to know where the bodies were buried. A clerk? A rival? A ghost with a grudge? He didn't have a name yet, but the question gnawed at him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Liberty Bell was a thread, and pulling it was unraveling a web bigger than one crooked judge. He'd lit the fuse, but who'd handed him the match? The fallout hit like a freight train. Investigations fired up across 3 states, dragging in judges, lawyers, even a couple of lobbyists who thought they were untouchable. Headlines screamed about judicial corruption and conservative witch hunts, and talking heads on every channel picked it apart like vultures on roadkill. Some called Vance a hero, others a meddler, but he didn't care much either way. He'd come to tell the truth about Donovan, not to play savior. The rest, the arrests, the exposés, the whole damn reckoning, was just what happened when you kicked over the right rock. Hayes didn't go quiet. Even from a holding cell, he was still mouthing off, swearing he'd been set up, claiming he'd spill bigger names if they cut him a deal. The feds didn't bite. They had enough to bury him 10 times over, and more kept coming. Clerks flipped, witnesses sang, and every new piece locked the cage tighter. His reign was done, a cautionary tale scribbled in the margins of every law book from here to Ohio. But Vance knew it wasn't the end. There'd be others, always were, ready to step into the same shadows Hayes had danced in. Back in the real world, life kept moving. Donovan rebuilt, the courthouse got a new judge, and Vance went back to the grind, another fight waiting around the corner. But that day stuck with him, a reminder of how thin the line is between power and ruin. Hayes had thought he was the law, thought he could bend it, break it, own it. He'd been wrong, and it cost him everything. The lesson wasn't in the win, though. It was in the why. Truth doesn't need a title or a gavel. It just needs someone stubborn enough to stand up and say it. In a country built on that idea, the fight's never over. So next time you see the scales tipping, what's it going to be? Silence or a spark? That's the heartbeat of justice, and it's up to you to keep it pumping. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. The lessons we take from it remind us of the importance of truth, integrity, and standing up for what is right. Your support means everything to us. If you enjoyed the story, simply hit the like button, leave a comment below to let us know which country you're from, and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps us continue bringing meaningful stories to you.